Hello friends, my name is JJ, and as you might have heard, we had a big election in Canada the other day, probably one of the most anticipated Canadian elections that we have had in a while, and certainly an election of unusually high interest to people outside of Canada. The results, however, are a little bit difficult to summarize in a single snappy headline. On the one hand, Prime Minister Carney won. The former interim Prime Minister, who assumed office following Justin Trudeau's resignation in March, is now Canada's duly elected leader and will be governing the country for the near future. But I have to say near future, because Carney did somewhat under-deliver. He failed to win a majority of seats in the parliament, and in that sense is not really in that much of a stronger place than Trudeau was during his third term, when he also didn't control the parliamentary majority and was considered to be in a pretty precarious governing position. Then, as now, if all of the opposition parties got together, they could theoretically pass a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister and trigger an early emergency election. That sword of Damocles has not gone away. And in that sense, Canadian politics has retained the atmosphere of drama and uncertainty that has defined the last 5 years or so. So it is a bit of an ambiguous outcome. The Liberal Party's rule of Canada will now extend past a decade, but we are also entering what could be the longest period of Canadian history in which no one party controls a majority of seats in the parliament. Alrighty, now let us dive deeper into each of the parties one at a time and discuss their fates in more detail. But before we get into that, let us hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, everybody's favorite, Ground News. Hello friends, so yes, it is true, today's video was once again brought to you by Ground News, the very awesome all-in-one media aggregator app that not only helps you stay on top of the latest headlines, but also understand the various slants and biases that characterize modern reporting. So for example, take a big story like Mark Carney winning the election. Ground News has gathered 654 different articles from 654 different news sites, all reporting on the same event, and you can see that they sort them based on the biased ways that these outlets tend to frame things. Already, we can see that this is a story that is apparently much more likely to be covered by the liberal press, which I guess makes sense, seeing as how it is a bit more of a feel-good story for progressives, especially foreign ones. But what I like best is how you can quickly see at a glance the different ways that the same event is being spun. So for example, in the Calgary Sun, which is a conservative newspaper up here, they had a headline reading, "Hockey and nostalgia won't keep us together. Albertans say they're serious about separation after Liberal win." Yikes. But then here is how the American lefties over at Mediaite framed it. American betrayal. New Canadian PM Mark Carney torches Trump in victory speech after election win. So to them, this is all about Republicans getting owned. Everyone's favorite Ground News feature, however, is their famous blind spot locator. This is when you can see stories that are basically only being reported by one side or another. For example, in a Canadian context, one story that apparently didn't get much coverage in the conservative press in this country was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's evident delight at Prime Minister Carney's victory. Ford has become a pretty disliked figure among Canadian conservatives lately, and I guess the left really likes rubbing it in. So yes, an excellent app that you can use on both desktop and mobile. And if you scan this QR code or click on the link in the thing below, you can save 40% on a Vantage plan offering unlimited access. So don't delay, get outside of your biased media bubble and give Ground News a try today. So Mark Carney is now unambiguously one of the great success stories of Canadian politics. In taking the reins of the Canadian Liberals from Justin Trudeau, he has dramatically revived the popularity of a party that had previously sunk to record lows. And there are a few standard explanations you tend to hear on how he did this. The big one is, of course, his savviness in turning the election into a referendum on Canada's relationship with Donald Trump's America. In a poll released by Abacus Data shortly before the election, most Liberal voters identified standing up to Trump as the central issue animating their party, and that was perhaps understandable given that this was a message that Carney hammered incessantly. Donald Trump, the man who had threatened Canada with crushing tariffs and repeatedly vowed to make us into the 51st state, was cast as an existential threat to Canada that only Carney could effectively understand and oppose.
President Trump wants to break us so America can own us. We will not let that happen. And so the key question in this election is who is the best place to respond to that? Who will stand up to President Trump? Who will stand up for you? Who will stand up for Canadians? Canada is not America. No. Look at this room. Canada is a mosaic. We are all Canadians. We are all distinct. America is a melting pot. In America, healthcare is a big business. In Canada, it is a right.
The Prime Minister characterized his conservative rival, Pierre Poilievre, meanwhile, as a kind of mini-Trump, a fellow right-wing populist who had too much in common with MAGA to effectively resist this hostile White House.
Everything is broken.
Everything is broken. Fake news.
Fake news.
The left-wing censorship regime.
Their woke censorship ideology.
Defeating the radical left.
Radical, leftist, authoritarian.
We want those great Canadian truckers to know that we are with them all the way.
I'm proud of the truckers and I stand with them.
Have turned our once great cities into cesspools of bloodshed and crime.
Unleashed a crime wave like we have never seen.
In campaigning this way, Carney was also able to tap into a much deeper well of Canadian anxiety. I'm talking of this omnipresent paranoia that has been around for decades that posits that conservative Americans lust to conquer Canada and turn it into a right-wing dystopia, much like their own country. It's a theory that frames Canada's national identity as not just a rejection of America, but a rejection of Republican America specifically, which then flows naturally into casting Canadian conservatives as dangerous and unpatriotic. Trump thus becomes a literal manifestation of this deep-seated Canadian fear of a right-wing takeover, an actual walking, talking boogeyman of flesh and blood. Now, it's worth noting that this is an anxiety that tends to resonate particularly well with older Canadians, you know, like boomers whose image of America has been heavily shaped by things like memories of the unrest of the 1960s, or Vietnam, or Nixon, or just greater sensitivity to things like the importance of universal health care, which they would have obviously had more reason to make use of over the years. Pre-election polls noted a pretty sharp movement of Canadian boomers to the Liberals in this election, a migration that at one point got so worrying to the Conservatives that they actually released a pretty remarkable ad explicitly targeting old white men. You might assume that that's a fairly reliable conservative voting bloc, but apparently not these days. I heard someone say that the re-election of Trump was basically 9/11 for Canadian boomers, and while that might be overstating things just a bit, it is definitely fair to say that Trump's open hostility to this country was considered nothing short of a national crisis by a lot of Canadians, and an issue of such enormous importance, it basically superseded the need to make this year's election about anything else. Now, all that said, it also has to be acknowledged that Prime Minister Carney was just quite personally popular. Carney has now won a larger share of the popular vote than Trudeau ever did, in fact, making him the most popular Liberal Prime Minister since Pierre Trudeau in 1980. The Canadian electoral system, however, continues to produce a rather odd disunity between how popular a candidate is and how many seats they win in the Parliament, which you will see is a bit of a theme today. But the point is, when Carney first became Prime Minister back in March, he had an approval rating of around 40%. It climbed steadily throughout his first week in power and remained high throughout the campaign, hovering around 50%. Trudeau hasn't had an approval rating like that since COVID. And more importantly, Pierre Poilievre has never had an approval rating that high in the entire 2 years that he has been head of the Conservative Party. Even a few months ago, when Pierre was favored to win the election, his personal unpopularity was still quite high. In the end, Carney proved to be a pretty unifying figure for the Liberals, someone who had strong appeal to both old and young Canadians, and Canadians all across the left end of the political spectrum, and in vote-rich Ontario and Quebec. And all of this is quite interesting to me, just as a case study in candidate marketing. Carney is a wealthy white man in his 60s and a self-described elite. He has no experience in elected politics and has instead spent much of his life working for powerful financial institutions at a time when many people distrust such things. He has no connection to French-Canadian culture, which is usually considered pretty essential in Canadian politics, and has indeed spent much of his adult life outside of Canada altogether. And yet, he has a long resume of qualifications and is an effective communicator who really owns who he is. I'm often struck by his very calm, unflappable demeanor, which I guess comes from being a guy who's done so many things that nothing much really intimidates you anymore. It definitely seems to suggest that things like authenticity and perceived competence matter a great deal in politics, and that we can overstate the degree that progressive voters care about things like identity politics or ideological purity. Because I definitely don't think if we were to design the imagined liberal dream candidate who could prove more popular than Justin Trudeau, he would look like this. Pierre Poilievre was made head of the Conservative Party in 2022, and for the last 2 years, he had been gearing up for an election that he assumed would be defined by two things: Justin Trudeau and Canada's high cost of living, as embodied by Trudeau's much despised carbon tax. But then, Justin Trudeau dropped out of the race, and Mark Carney's first act as Prime Minister was to repeal the carbon tax. Trump's belligerence against Canada was also ramping up around this time. But even if Trump had never gotten re-elected, Pierre would have still faced the considerable challenge of having to completely reorient his campaign for Prime Minister around a different opponent and different issues. And Pierre just never seemed to have a good plan B as far as that goes. In the end, the Conservative campaign mostly revolved around a call for change. Canada needed a change of perspective, policy, and leadership after 10 years under the Liberals.
Canada needs change. Change. Change.
The only problem was Carney represented change as well, since he was also an outsider who wasn't responsible for the policies of the last decade. The Conservatives tried hard to convince voters that this was disingenuous because Carney had actually been advising Trudeau on economic policy behind the scenes for years, but it didn't seem to stick. Pierre might have been better liked than Trudeau, but Carney was better liked than Pierre. Elections are always a popularity contest to some extent, and the Conservatives were definitely harmed by having a candidate who had never been that popular, only popular relative to someone else. At the same time, we shouldn't overstate the magnitude of Pierre's loss. Just as Carney won more of the popular vote than Justin Trudeau ever did, Pierre actually won more of the popular vote than noted three-term Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper ever did. Loser or not, Pierre is still one of the most successful Conservative Party leaders in the last 40 years, and he did deliver a strong enough showing to deny Carney a parliamentary majority. Pierre's focus on cost of living issues has likewise been credited with helping make the Conservative Party quite popular with young voters, which definitely feels like it could be a great asset for the party going forward. In fact, near the end, a lot of Canadian political analysts were observing the degree that the Canadian elections seemed to be turning into a bit of a generational culture war, in which you had financially comfortable, anti-American liberal voting boomers on one side, and financially anxious, more pro-American millennials and Zoomers on the other. The rather strange epilogue to all of this is that Pierre actually lost his own seat in the Parliament. All Canadian party leaders usually hold seats in the Parliament, and while it isn't that uncommon for them to lose them, it is very, very unusual for a party leader to lose his seat in the context of an election in which his party generally did pretty well. If you ask me, this mostly just reflects the fact that most Canadians do not know or care who their local member of Parliament is, because most Canadians understand that the only real point of electing an MP is to indirectly elect someone to be Prime Minister, and Pierre just happened to be running in the sort of district where the Liberals did well this year, which is to say, suburban Ontario. It's not obvious to me that his loss really means much more than that. But that said, it is undeniably a big embarrassment added on top of the embarrassment of losing the race for Prime Minister. It will have no actual effect on his ability to remain head of the Conservative Party, but I could see it being used as a pretext for him to step down, just given the amount of symbolic importance that Canadian political culture puts on having party leaders who are able to sit and debate in the parliament. Okay, so there is basically no positive spin on this one. The NDP faced a total bloodbath in this election, winning only a measly 7 seats, their worst showing in all of Canadian history. To find numbers this bad, you have to go all the way back to their very first election as a socialist protest party during the Great Depression. Party boss Jagmeet Singh lost his own seat, which again doesn't really mean all that much unto itself. But in this case, it does emphasize to the degree that the NDP was just hemorrhaging seats everywhere. Unlike Pierre, he immediately announced his resignation as party leader. Now, the NDP will likely flatter themselves with this terrible result and chalk down their losses to just strategic voting among progressives. If nothing else, the NDP is always very good at finding a way to declare themselves morally vindicated by basically any election outcome. But in any case, in this election, and especially in the lead up to it, I think it's fair to say that the NDP did very little to make the case for themselves. The decision to run Jagmeet Singh a third time was really quite baffling, given he had never been a popular guy. And yet, NDP insiders tend to have a unfortunate, I'm sorry to say, cult-like loyalty to their leaders, in which they give them endless second or third chances, as we can see from this chart. The only exception was Thomas Mulcair, who was a party convert and thus always distrusted by the party establishment. Just anecdotally, whenever I would talk to the sort of young left-wing Canadians who you would expect to be the sort of reliable NDP base, I was always struck by how often they would just openly say they were sick of Jagmeet and how much they preferred Mark Carney. When I was younger, there was definitely a sense that voting NDP was like the very principled and even slightly rebellious thing to do, while voting Liberal was a sign that you were like a establishment sellout. And I'm starting to get the impression that that sort of thinking has like dramatically faded in modern Canada. Lots of left-wing people, even young left-wing people, clearly do not find Carney and his Liberal Party embarrassing to support. And you see this borne out by the demographic data. In a pre-election Angus Reid poll, they had NDP support down to just 12% among young voters, the third choice among youth voters overall, and down from 31% and first place in 2021. Likewise, they found an amazing 56% of people who voted NDP in 2021 saying that they would be voting Liberal this time. So I mean, you could speculate that this was all very cynical and strategic, that progressive voters were so terrified of a Polya victory that they were willing to vote Liberal in order to prevent any possibility of vote splitting on the left. Or, you know, you could say that maybe they just thought Carney would be a better prime minister. The weird epilogue to this story is that even as a shriveled rump of their former selves, the NDP will still hold an outsized role in the next parliament, just because Carney doesn't have control of an outright majority of seats. When you look at these numbers, you might think to yourself, oh, well, you know, Carney can probably get a few moderate conservatives to support him on things now and then. But this is not how politics works in Canada. Parties always vote as unified blocs on every issue. So Carney will have to take it for granted that no matter what he puts forward, it is likely to face unified opposition from the Conservatives. The NDP, however, is in theory more ideologically aligned and has just enough votes to get him over 50%. In the last parliament, Prime Minister Trudeau signed an agreement with Jagmeet Singh, which was the closest that this country has ever come to adopting a European-style coalition government, and it seems like Carney could be forced by necessity to do something similar with whoever becomes the new head of the NDP. This will then have the rather undemocratic consequence of giving a party that won just 6% of the vote outsized influence over the agenda of a prime minister who just finished crushing them. Okay, and speaking of 6%, the French-Canadian Separatist Party, the Bloc Québécois, had a fairly decent election night, winning 22 seats in Quebec. They lost about 10 seats to the Liberals, but also didn't face the NDP-style wipeout that some had predicted. However, late in the election, the head of the bloc, YFB, made some rather spitefully anti-Canadian comments that got him a lot of bad press.
We are, either we like it or not, part of an artificial country with very little meaning called Canada. It's a foreign parliament because this nation is not mine.
Obviously, to be a separatist is to have some degree of contempt for the country that you're trying to separate from. But over the decades, it was sort of taken for granted that the Bloc Québécois had lost most of its edge and was sort of assimilated into the Canadian political establishment. For YFB to come out and say these things and then double down on saying them a day later, I think will re-toxify his party significantly.
It's a non-nation, a country which denies its own identity. And ironically, with a central government which wants to control the jurisdictions of every provinces slowly but surely. So maybe this country is a bit artificial.
Carney will still probably have to lean on them for support now and then, but openly courting them, I think, will be very taboo. I mean, Carney just won an election in which he positioned himself as the great champion of Canadian sovereignty and nationalism and patriotism. After all of that, is he really going to link arms with someone who shares Trump's belief that Canada is a fake country? Lastly, the dumb Green Party won 1% of the vote in a single seat. The one held by Supreme Party Leader for Life, Elizabeth May, who's been running the party in some form or another for close to 20 years now.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth May. I'm leader of the Green Party of Canada.
For the last 20 years, the Canadian political press has been very politely treating Elizabeth May like she's eventually going to accomplish something. And in return, Elizabeth May's party has been getting progressively less popular. This was the first year since 2008 in which the Green Party was excluded from the prime ministerial debates, and I think it will be very difficult to justify including them again, barring some huge upswing in their popularity. I've often wondered if Elizabeth May's endgame is to just eventually convert to the Liberals and get a job as a cabinet minister or something. She is starting to get up there in years, and in one way or another, the fate of this tiny, strange party is inseparable from her own.
But it looks like we'll go back into the House of Commons with a minority where we can make a difference, with me as leader of the Green Party, with a prime minister I've known for a few decades, and we've started off nicely tonight. What can I say?
Alrighty, so that is my summary of the big, exciting Canadian election of 2025. Like I said at the start, it has been the subject of a great deal more global attention than is usual for a Canadian election, in large part because the results have been widely interpreted as a big, throbbing middle finger to Donald Trump. But hopefully this video has helped you appreciate some of the uniquely Canadian nuances. With the election now over, I want to take a break from Canadian political videos for a while and get back to cultural analysis. But in any case, thank you to everybody who has been watching my Canadian election videos. The numbers have been awesome, and it really does mean a lot to me that so many people around the world consider me a useful source of Canadian political commentary. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and a subscribe, and I will see you next week.